Thank you everyone for joining us for our weekly Wednesday seminars. Thank you, Bernard, for agreeing to share your work and your time with us. Bernard Seymour is a PhD candidate in history at Michigan State University. He also teaches history at University of Namibia. His research concerns the economic and environmental history of agriculture in southern Namibia during the apartheid era, with a focus on labor relations in the Karakul sheep industry. He's currently completing a dissertation on the subject. He has published articles in the Journal of Southern African Studies and Journal of Namibian Studies. Thank you, Bernard. And the housekeepings we've already discussed. We have more than about 30 or 35 minutes, but I understand that you have a shorter presentation, but feel free to take as much time as you need. And then after that, we'll have whatever time is left, 20, 25 minutes, half an hour for discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So yeah, I would just like to show my appreciation to Dr. Sen and Francisco for inviting me to share some of my research here at UCT. Let me just arrange for my screen to be shared so that you all can see my presentation. Prof, can you see the title page now?
Yes, we can see that. That's
all right, very good. Okay, so yes, my name is Bernie Moore. And so before I begin, I just want to say I'm a bit of a sucker for photographs. So rather than giving you these big blocks of text, my presentation is mostly just photos and charts. So hopefully you're all able to follow along. So with that out of the way, let's begin with Their Days Are Numbered, Jackals, Shepherds, and Apartheid in Namibia. So as I'm also going to attempt to stick to the script in order to maintain time. So as one drives south from Windhoek, Namibia's capital, towards South Africa, it's impossible to miss the fences which line the farm boundaries throughout this arid region. They're a very unique kind of fence called jackal-proof. Unlike standard stock-proof fences, which are intended to keep sheep inside farm boundaries and within designated grazing camps, jackal-proof fencing is intended to keep predators out. Rather than 4 to 6 galvanized steel wires of stock-proof fencing, jackal-proof features a 4-foot-high wire mesh netting. The top of the fence features 2 strands of barbed wire, and about 6 inches of the fence is buried under the ground or covered with stones. The material isn't chicken wire. This is strong materials, as you can see from this lovely cutting that I'm holding now. Always got to have a little show and tell. Prior to its independence in 1990, Namibia, then called Southwest Africa, witnessed the erection of massive quantities of fencing and other forms of agricultural technology. Quite a lot of this was subsidized by the apartheid government as a way to ensure the financial success of its white, Afrikaans-speaking settler population, naturally at the expense of the indigenous African majority, who made up the bulk of the poorly paid farm labor force. Between 1954 and 1970, over 40,000 kilometers of jackal-proof and 95,000 kilometers of ordinary stock-proof fencing was built throughout the territory, the former taking place primarily in the arid sheep farming districts of the South. So yes, you've heard those numbers correctly. That is enough fencing to circumnavigate the globe 3 times over. This fencing and other agricultural technologies like pipeline, borehole drilling, and irrigation works was subsidized at an average rate of 25% by the apartheid regime. And in most sheep farming districts, jackal-proofing farm boundaries was mandatory, resulting in heavy fines if construction was delayed or avoided. But why jackal-proof fencing? Why did the apartheid state and its white residents invest so heavily in this expensive form of agricultural technology? The answers to these questions are at the same time ecological and economic. So let's start with some of the ecological. The arid southern districts of Namibia are sheep country, pure and simple. With rainfall averaging between 70 and 150 millimeters per year, the average farm cannot sustain large-scale cattle production, even with the massive farm sizes in this region, averaging more than 20,000 hectares per farming operation. When the South African administration took over the colonial project after Germany's defeat in the First World War, farm settlement in Namibia was sparse, especially in the southern districts. Seeking a way to profit from their newly acquired colony, South Africa launched a large-scale land settlement program, bringing in poor whites from the Northern Cape and the Transvaal in order to take up farming in Namibia. Loans for the purchase of farms and breeding stock were generous, and sheep farming was encouraged. Especially after the strong drought of 1929 to 1933, many of these so-called poor whites were finding themselves in financial ruin, as farming in arid Namibia was not comparable with their situation in South Africa. Merino sheep were not successful, as both they and cattle died in droves during the drought. The colonial project in southern Namibia was saved by an unusual breed of sheep called Karakul. These sheep originate in the arid mountainous steppes of Central Asia, and they proved hardy enough to handle Namibia's rocky landscape and frequent droughts. Furthermore, unlike most forms of sheep breeding in southern Africa, where the goal is mutton or wool, Karakul is about lambskin pelts. Lambs are slaughtered within the first 24 days of life, when the pelt is softest and the hair fibers are most acceptable to the eventual target export market, namely the international fur fashion industry. Consignments of dried pelts are sent to international auction houses in Europe, where they are sold to designers for the production of women's coats. In order to meet the demands of the fur industry, Namibia's Karakul sector, known by the trademark origin name Swakara, have through selective breeding transformed the hair length, pattern, color, and thickness of pelts. While Karakuls are traditionally black, breeders have since the 1930s made white, gray, and brown Karakul stud flocks, and genetic code was protected through government legislation. In fact, it was a crime to export live Karakul sheep or semen outside the borders of Namibia, even to South Africa itself, the colonial occupier. After the Great Drought of 1929 to 1933, it was clear that those farmers keeping Karakul sheep suffered the least amount of losses. And after 1934, nearly all loans and subsidies for livestock purchases in southern Namibia went to Karakul sheep. As this example of the southernmost Warmbad district shows, the regional flock was effectively rebuilt after this drought with a completely different breed, Karakul. While Karakul sheep were only about 8% of the small stock in 1928, by the Second World War, they were approaching 70%. This was a period of transformation in the white farming community of southern Namibia. Those who had entered as so-called poor whites were now effectively specialized fur breeders tied to international fur markets. The growth of pelt exports after the Great Drought is indicative of this transformation. For a half century, Karakul breeding was the mainstay of the agricultural sector in Namibia as a whole, and especially its southern districts. Furthermore, it wasn't until the 1950s that the Karakul sector was overtaken by diamond and copper mining. But of course, with every growth in a specific industry, there are bottlenecks of sort. In southern Namibia, this was particularly the case with predators, and the most significant of these is the black jackal, which has been a constant plague to sheep farmers. The jackal is what carnivore ecologists call a mesopredator, a mid-sized predator with a more varied diet, which can reach fairly high population densities in areas near human occupation. As Southern Africa's settler population grew alongside pastoral pursuits, more and more of these apex predator species, such as lion, were decimated, allowing the jackal and other mesopredators to move from sort of a semi-scavenger role to that of a full-time predator. Furthermore, more and more of the pastures of the region became filled with lambs and sheep, much easier to catch than springbok and more satisfying than dassies and rodents. As one professional jackal hunter near Gruno remarked to me, quote, "Man has manufactured the ideal place for the jackal to multiply." In recent years, historians such as William Bainart and social scientists such as Janie Swanepoel, Renil Terblanche, Nicolai Natras, and Beatrice Conradi have explored the social context of jackal predation in Southern Africa, particularly how control and extermination measures evolved alongside increasing sheep losses. Many of these authors note how the jackal himself adapted his behavior as well, changing breeding and predation strategies. They also address the conflict between local knowledge of white farmers and so-called scientific knowledge of predator ecologists. While the aforementioned authors present fairly nuanced ecological and cultural arguments concerning human-jackal relations, some of the more crude applications of these perspectives, such as that of Nikki Rust and Nick Taylor of the subfield Human-Animal Studies, instead seek to psychoanalyze control methods as emblematic of psychotic and speciesist tendencies on the part of farmers. While I think we can more or less dismiss flatly the latter treatment of these debates, the former, Boehner, Terre-Blanche, Swanepoel, etc., still have some shortcomings, particularly that the actions of African shepherds are downplayed and pre-colonial vermin control methods are removed from these historical narratives. Correcting this oversight isn't just an issue of representing underrepresented voices, it is though, but it's more than that. It's also that understanding the actions, knowledge, and skills of shepherds helps us understand the significance of these technological and economic changes in the sheep farming sphere. With that in mind, in order to understand the structural significance of this 40,000 kilometers of jackal-proof fencing and all its corollary infrastructural changes, let's briefly enter the world of Namibia's shepherds in order to understand pre-colonial and early colonial methods of vermin control. Only then can we understand these changes in the productive forces. So, in addition to moving flocks to grazing and drinking sites, it was also the shepherd's duty to protect livestock from jackals and other predators. We can broadly define pre-colonial and early colonial vermin control as defensive in nature, defensive. Strategies were cultivated by shepherds in southern Namibia, mostly ethnic Namas, to protect livestock from predation, not necessarily to eliminate predators per se. So to protect from predation, not necessarily to eliminate predators. To accomplish this, dogs were crucial, and shepherds formed close relationships with their canine assistants. Dogs were first acquainted with the shepherd, and according to some testimonies, sweat was key. Shepherds constantly applied sweat from their underarms to the dog's nostrils, and the same sweat was then wiped upon the sheep's wool. It was also reported that in pre-colonial times, Nama shepherds carried bits of dried meat in their shoes, allowing it to accumulate sweat, and then giving it to their dogs as a reward for protecting the flock from a jackal. If the shepherd had to leave a flock for a time, it was reported to me that shepherds would tear strips of an old shirt or rag and tie it around the necks of some of the sheep. Not only would the smell of the shepherd's sweat from the shirt keep the dogs close to the flock, but it would also cause jackals to catch the shepherd's scent. During the first half of the 20th century, shepherding practices remained fairly similar, even though the social and political context had changed drastically. The 1903 to 1907 Namibian genocide at the hands of the Germans reduced the Nama population by at least a third and the Herero by up to half. This led to widespread labor shortages in farm areas. Unfamiliar with arid Namibia, some of these newly settled Afrikaans farmers were dependent upon local shepherds. At this time, few farms had reliable boreholes dug, and poisonous plants abounded in the area. So the skills of these Nama shepherds in flock management and ecological knowledge was essential. Nama shepherds were often courted with grazing access, as the communal reserves in the aftermath of genocide, which were barely expanded after the South Africans took over, they were overgrazed and overcrowded. Newly settled white farmers rarely had the ability to exploit the entirety of southern Namibia's massive farms. So shepherds were often permitted to bring their families and reside with some stock on a corner of the parcel. However, racism, corporal punishment, and abusive working conditions meant that Nama shepherds at the same time were often willing to contravene these masters and servants legislation to return to communal reserves. This exacerbated white farmers' perceptions of labor shortage. Using their newfound wealth earned from Karakul pelts, white farmers from southern Namibia responded by taking steps to import migrant workers from northern Namibia and southern Angola to take up work as shepherds on 18-month labor contracts. While migrant laborers' salaries were slightly higher than those of local Nama workers, these young men were now more than 1,000 kilometers from home, and they had little opportunity to desert abusive working conditions. Furthermore, in the context of needing genetic purity for the Karakul flocks, as opposed to mutton and meat sheep breeds where you just care about the animals being fat, migrant laborers were not permitted to bring livestock to the farm. These migrant workers, however, could not completely replace local Nama shepherds, as they constantly needed training in flock management, local ecological conditions, and vermin control. This training was more often than not provided by the Nama for whom they were intended to replace. Besides the perennial work of shepherding, Karakul farming also required large amounts of seasonal labor. This was the case during shearing season, for example. Even though the wool is nearly worthless, Karakul still must be sheared twice annually. Furthermore, when there are outbreaks of scab or other skin diseases, sheep have to be then dipped in order to kill off these parasites, often being done after shearing. In addition, during lambing season, workers were often needed to prepare stud lambs for registration with the Karakul Board of Namibia, or then of Southwest, as well as aiding the farm owner in identifying which lambs to slaughter for pelts and which to keep for the flock's next generation. During lamb season, pelting is a very delicate job, requiring lots of training, as improper skinning procedure or framing can damage the pelt and affect its value on the fur market. Despite this, however, the job, like shearers, remains seasonal to this day. Following the Second World War, however, the labor dilemma was becoming more and more stark in the rural areas of southern Namibia. Concerning local Nama labor, the vast majority of Namas were already present as employees or tenants on white farms themselves, and the remaining were farming in the reserves, avoiding these abusive working conditions. Furthermore, migrant workers in the post-Second World War period were increasingly avoiding farm labor as much as possible, taking up higher paying work in the expanding mining and fisheries sectors. A series of commissions launched in the late 1940s recognized these issues as major problems for the sheep farming sector. Eventually, with the chairman of the Karakul Industry Advisory Board, York van Schutz, advocating in 1957 for widespread jackal-proof fencing construction as the solution to this labor dilemma. Van Schutz was writing in the context of change legislation during the 1950s, whereby the Southwest Africa administration had performed an abrupt turnaround regarding how they were to support white settlers. New settlers should not be brought in so long as the existing settlers were failing to sustain themselves, whether due to ecological conditions or economic conditions. Therefore, funds were instead directed towards capital improvements such as dam building, borehole drilling, windmill purchase, and crucially, fence construction. This began to take shape after 1952 with the formation of the Farming Interests Board and soil conservation districts. This was parallel legislation. In order to access low interest loans and high subsidies towards the purchase and construction of farm infrastructure from the Farming Interest Board, one joins a regional soil conservation district and shows that said planned infrastructure will help manage things like soil erosion and pasture conditions. Interestingly, however, throughout most of the existence of the Farming Interest Board in Namibia, the majority of funds were directed towards fencing, especially jackal-proof fencing. Supporters of jackal-proof, such as van Schutz, sought for it to become mandatory throughout all sheep farming districts of Namibia. The administrator of Southwest Africa at the time, Johannes van der Vaart, was originally a Karakul farmer from Stampriet himself, and he agreed. So van Schutz was appointed chairman of a commission of inquiry to establish mandatory jackal-proof districts. This commission, it traveled throughout southern Namibia in 1955 and 1956, meeting with several hundred farmers to learn about the effects of jackal-proof from those who had already constructed it with loans and subsidies from the board, but also to learn of what made others hesitant. Nearly every single farmer interviewed by the commission extolled the labor-saving qualities of jackal-proof. Upon constructing jackal-proof boundary fencing, farmers would engage in large-scale eradication of all existing jackals and other carnivores on the farms. Shepherds would then assist in the construction of internal camp fencing and for rotational grazing, and helped lay pipeline to provide distant camps with water. With jackal-proof, according to the farmers who had completed the process, between 30 and 70% of shepherds could be released within a few months. Some farmers were able to release all of their shepherds, relying instead on just general farm laborers to assist with moving sheep from camp to camp. The commission found virtually no disagreement regarding the second major upside of jackal-proof fencing, easing the elimination of predators, greatly increasing the profits of farms through reduced stock losses. Jackal-proofing doesn't kill predators, but it does control the movement of the blackback jackal and other carnivores, facilitating decimation of these species through collaborative efforts within the white farming community. This collaborative element in the commission was key, and it would indicate how the landscape of Namibia would change in coming years. Farmers recognized that elimination of the threat of predation, the threat of jackals eating one's sheep, meant eliminating predators full stop. This had to be a regional effort rather than one of just individual so-called progressive farmers. They looked to the Australian dingo fence, as pictured here, as an example of a state-led initiative to transform the fauna of a sheep farming country, and they viewed jackal-proof as analogous. In order to appease those against mandatory jackal-proof, the legislation placed jackal-proof at the level of these soil conservation committees, from whom a majority member vote would then make it mandatory within the boundaries. As you can see in this image, the vast majority of southern Namibia passed the legislation. This created a block of more than 2,000 jackal-proof farms. And even those in these gray areas that were not part of communal areas still could receive subsidies, however, even if it no longer was mandatory. Now, if we described vermin control during the first half of the 20th century as defensive, post-jackal-proofing, this process became offensive. Alongside fencing legislation came ordinances to mandate jackal hunting associations among farmers within these jackal-proof zones. They were to perform minimum 1 hunt per quarter. In 1956 alone, more than 29 of these hunting associations were formed. And while jackals were the main target, other species such as roikat and leopard were also included on this list of so-called vermin. Furthermore, jackal hunting associations were the only entities permitted after 1956 to lay gin traps and poison, as well as so-called jackal cannons, pictured here, which utilized tripwires and buckshot in order to eliminate the vermin threat. While the majority of poison lain with strychnine, by the 1960s, farmers were increasingly using so-called blowgif, which is 1080 monosodium fluoroacetate, an incredibly powerful poison, which proved exceedingly effective at cleaning camps of jackals. As jackal-proof boundary fencing was approaching completion within these mandated districts, this was now in the mid-1960s, extermination of jackals and other predators was reaching alarming proportions. Between 20,000 and 30,000 jackals were reported killed in 1965 alone, and likely many, many more went unreported. Regarding predators, one magistrate in southern Namibia remarked in 1965, quote, "Vermin are still being eradicated, but their days are numbered." In the immediate aftermath of jackal-proofing, most resident jackals and breeding dens had to be cleaned out with labor-intensive brute force. So you've jackal-proofed the boundaries, but now you must clean inside the boundaries. This labor-intensive brute force was done through dogs, horses, workers, and guns. However, once that is completed, maintaining a jackal-proofed farm, however, required capital-intensive solutions: traps, jackal cannons, poisons. These were key. It's nearly impossible to keep vermin completely out of a farm, even if jackal-proof fencing is strong. But with these traps and with these poisons and maintaining the boundary, it's possible to reduce predation from what it was before, which was about 3.5% of stock per annum, to a near zero rate. One of the favorite tools for sheep farmers in the 1960s through the 1980s was the coyote getter, known locally as the gifskytter. A steel or aluminum stake could be hammered into the ground, and a spring or gunpowder ejection device is then loaded upon the jackal, or any canine, I suppose, biting down upon the dried meat bait. The ejector launches a cyanide capsule into the animal's mouth. Death of the jackal is quite swift. Gifskytters were imported en masse from the United States and distributed among these jackal hunting associations. Importantly, they could be laid in mountainous terrain where inspection of these fencing boundaries was difficult. And in my conversations with elderly farmers, many have recollected to me that in killing jackals, they had the best success with these coyote getters. With a near jackal-free property, farmers could now direct their funds and efforts towards constructing rotational grazing camps, drilling new boreholes, laying pipeline to distant camps, and increasing farm technology more generally. This chart regarding a survey of farmers near Helmeringhausen in Batani district reveals this transformation clearly. The raw quantities of camps increased and the average size of camps decreased alongside further development of water infrastructure. This was not just a jackal-proofing the boundaries, but this was fundamentally changing farm infrastructure as a whole. In a lot of ways, the Jackal-Proof Fencing Commission's predictions proved correct. Not only was the farm labor shortage eased, but farmers were able to dismiss and evict large numbers of their tenant populations, as well as full-time farm workers. Farms never became shepherdless, but there were significantly fewer shepherds employed in the industry. General farm workers also reduced in number, increasingly taking up sort of ad hoc duties, such as shearing or pelting on a seasonal or per diem basis. With the advent of electrical shearing machines, as pictured here, not only were fewer shearers needed for the biannual shearing, but the job required less training and inherited skill than that of hand shears. Now, I don't have the time to go deeply into the farm evictions to Namaland, southern Namibia's apartheid-era homeland. I've recently published an article in JSAS which deals with this a bit. But suffice it to say that overcrowding, overgrazing, and unemployment within the homeland was in part caused by these large-scale labor reductions on sheep farms in the South during the 1960s and 70s. Now, while the majority of labor transformations were of a reduction sort, workers now becoming unemployed, there was one new position which emerged from the chaos, that of the wire watcher or the camp walker. Using a motorbike, a horse, or his own feet, the wire watcher follows along the jackal-proof boundary fencing, looking for breaks in the wire or holes which are dug underneath. This was often a per diem job, perhaps 2 days per week, and it remains one of the most common forms of farm labor in southern Namibia to this day. Maintenance of the jackal-proof boundary, especially once the interior camps are clean, or at least near clean, is often an obsession for farmers, leading some to allege that more money is actually spent on the diesel to patrol the boundary than would be lost on predation itself. But from the late 1970s, farmers began electrifying the jackal-proof with wire at the top, an electrified wire at the top to prevent roikats from climbing over, and another at the bottom to prevent animals from digging under. Importantly, while blackback jackals do occasionally dig under the jackal-proof, the majority is actually done by other species. The aardwolf is an insectivorous relative of the hyena, pictured here on the left, and it doesn't feed actually upon sheep or goats at all. Along with the aardvark, the pangolin, and the honey badger, this species digs underneath jackal-proof fencing in order to access new termite colonies. Prior to the 1950s and jackal-proof initiatives, these creatures were not often killed by farmers. They're insectivorous, after all. They eat insects. They actually provide a constructive role for these wooden fencing posts by eating thousands of termites each day. However, it was and remains widely recognized that jackals re-enter cleaned camps using the burrows from these insectivores. After cleaning the farms of jackals, in those days, white farmers then requested that these species be added to the official vermin list in order to maintain a jackal-proofed farm. The definition of what vermin was moving from predation to something very different. After jackal-proofing initiatives were underway or completed, aardwolves and other burrowing creatures became vermin, not because of active predation, but because of their interference with newly created agricultural technologies and the possibility of a shepherdless farm. Even as late as 1989, the eve of Namibian independence, aardvarks and honey badgers remained on the vermin list in jackal-proof districts, despite no evidence of any predation at all. Most scholars who have considered this concept of vermin in Southern Africa, or its American equivalent, varmint, have examined this category of animals either through the lens of how humans conceptualize what makes an animal species worthy or unworthy, worthy versus unworthy animals. I mean, after all, the Afrikaans word for vermin is ongedierte, which is sort of not really an animal or de-animalized. Or else these scholars are looking through the ecological perspective of genuine predation. While neither really of these approaches is inherently wrong, each loses sight of political economy in our studies of human-animal relations. These categories, vermin, pest, problem animal, they don't just reflect anthropocentric concepts of nature and space and environment. They're economic categories as well, reflecting specific historical developments of particular agricultural landscapes. Furthermore, the transformations and fluctuations in these categories reflects transformations in the productive forces, how we do sheep farming, as well as the power relations underlying all of this. To draw our study to a close, let's move a bit broader than simply sheep farming in southern Namibia. When we learn about the economic history of machinery, we're often taught about steam engines, smelters, automobiles, and other devices which transformed how we produce things, how we transform the world around us. We learn about how labor-intensive industries became capital-intensive ones. Marx and his followers wrote extensively about how machinery displaced workers, creating an underemployed industrial reserve army, driving down wages, or else it created a potentially subversive lumpen proletariat. While fencing doesn't necessarily strike us as representing, quote, modern machinery, it structurally functions in this way. In the same way that the adoption of power looms or steam engines represented a fundamental transformation in the productive forces in Europe, the adoption of jackal-proof fencing and associated technologies was a similar fundamental shift in Namibia. Post-jackal-proofing was not simply just an intensification of existing methods of vermin control and sheep farming. This was not quantitative, this was qualitative. This was intended to create a near shepherdless industry. The structural implications of jackal-proof fencing and poison and traps was just as much about culling shepherds from the farms as it was about culling jackals. Finally, we must consider machinery, including fencing, through the lens of skill. Shepherding in pre-colonial and early colonial periods of Namibian history was skilled labor. Knowledge about flock behavior and health was inherited generation to generation. So was awareness about local ecology. For this reason, in the legislation, shepherds earned higher salaries than non-shepherding farm laborers during the first half of the 20th century. Apartheid in southern Namibia, however, was in part about separating white agriculture from any large-scale dependence upon Black labor or Black knowledge. Jackal-proofing, camp construction, the development of water infrastructure, this mechanized sheep farming in the same way that power looms displaced those who would eventually become Luddites. Fixed capital in the form of fences absorbed the shepherd's skill, turning him into a machine operator of sorts. So to close, perhaps that magistrate, which I quoted earlier, was wrong. In reality, it was the shepherd's days which were numbered, not really the vermin. So I'll draw to a close now. Thank you all for your patience and for hearing me out. I'm interested in hearing if you have any thoughts or comments or critiques. So thank you all.
Thanks, Bernard. That's excellent. Really enjoyed it. If you can maybe stop sharing the screen.
Oh, yes. Okay, here we go.
Okay, so we already have a question from Peter Lim. Maybe would you like to ask the question, Peter, or do you want Bernard to just it would be great if you just could walk us through your question.
Hi, Bernie, and hi, everyone. I have a little bit of data on shepherds in the Free State from my own research, and I was just looking at it, and I wondered if you'd been able to excavate their lives, their social lives, or even you mentioned how they were becoming redundant, although you had a slide of one riding a motorbike, so I expect they're still around in some pastoral areas. But I wondered whether you've been able to get much of an idea of the depth of their lives in different areas from oral interviews or even from archives. But a very interesting talk, and congratulations on the article in JSAS as well.
Thank you, Professor Lim. Bernard, do you want to respond to the question,
Sure.
or do you want to take a few more, whatever?
Maybe I'll respond to Peter's question in the meantime,
Yes,
and in case others have other thoughts. Thanks for that, Peter. Long time no see. Yeah, I mean, you can reconstruct a bit of the lives of shepherds to a degree. It's a bit difficult, and it's not intensely the focus of my study, which is much more in economic history and environmental history. But yes, you can to a degree. You find narratives and letters written as complaints to the SWANLA, this migrant labor recruiting organization, from shepherds reporting abuse from their employers. So you get a little bit of day-to-day lives in the archives from that. The majority of it, however, often comes from oral history work, which is giving you a bit more insight into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, because there aren't a lot of folks who are alive who are remembering the 20s, 30s and stuff. But I'll give one little tidbit that I recently discovered. I met a guy who was a musician who came from, his father was a shepherd and uncles were shepherds, and he said, I sucked at being a shepherd, but I was great at being a musician. So he became sort of he would travel alongside the shearers who would go from farm to farm. And so he would learn all sorts of songs that people would enjoy in various different languages and stuff like this. And it sort of made me realize that I've been spending a lot of time talking about these big picture economic changes, but daily life, once you knock off, is also part of what being a shepherd is. So I hope that gives a little bit of insight to your question, but thank you.
Thanks, Bernard.
Yeah, that's great, thanks.
Thanks for the question, Professor Lim. We have a question from Nikolai.
Hello, yeah, sorry, that was really great. I really enjoyed that. Of course, it made me think a lot about the differences and the links between Namibia and the Karoo. And one of the things that struck me from your photographs were those new jackal roof fences, because in the Karoo, you don't see new ones. It's almost my impression from that whole political economy was it was really funded by subsidies and collective action amongst farmers. And once the subsidies stopped and the fences started to break down and some farmers started to leave, and then you had lifestyle farmers moving in, you didn't get those kind of collaborative cleaning up the jackals, and it's all kind of fallen over. Yet listening to you, it seems seamless, you know, like some sort of progression, and that the system is still extremely economical. Is that because the Karakul is still very profitable, that farmers can actually afford the diesel and the wire watches and all that wire and all that maintenance, which just no longer works like that in the Karoo? Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Bernard.
Thank you very much for that. It's an interesting point, and I think a little bit of it is that jackal proof was strung in South Africa a bit earlier. So I personally haven't seen it myself in that area, but one day I will take a look and see how they stand. So Karakul is no longer very profitable at all. I'd say it's maybe down to 5 to 10% of what the industry used to be. I had a chart of annual pelts, and you could see the general sort of bell curve structure of it. It's very weak now. But what farmers have done is they've shifted from pelt production to mutton production. So now they're farming mostly with Dorper sheep, which actually you could not farm with shepherds full stop. You can't do it, or at least not very profitably, because the Dorper sheep lacks a herd mentality. So while Karakul sheep, you can have a flock of several hundred together being managed by one or two shepherds. With Dorper, they prefer to graze in pairs or trios on one corner, one corner, one corner. So you sort of need to be able to let Dorper sheep run free. And so farmers, in response to high meat prices, have continued to maintain the jackal-proof boundaries, continued to lay traps, continued to put out these jackal cannons, as some of the pictures I've shown. The poison is now much harder to do, and while people still maintain it a little bit, it is illegal in most circumstances. But it's partially because the sheep farming has moved now from something that could be done with shepherds, but they wanted to do not with shepherds, to one that actually I'm not even sure it could successfully be done with shepherds at all. So that sort of is part of the reason for maintaining the boundaries and jackal-proof today.
Thanks.
That's great stuff. Questions, comments? Terry, yeah, please go ahead, Terry.
Hi, Bernard. Thanks for the talk, and sorry about the background noise. I was just wondering, in terms of how your work links with Frederick Lilje's work and his argument around the sort of shifting use of what used to be shepherds once enclosure occurs in Southern Africa, where he makes the argument that essentially, rather than looking after sheep, they now begin to look after the fence. I think the term he refers to them as is camp walkers, if I remember correctly. So I'm just wondering whether this notion of the days of the shepherd are numbered, or perhaps is it more a case of the days of the shepherd as looking after sheep are numbered, rather than the days of the shepherd, to core. Thanks.
Okay. Well, Thierry, thank you very much. That's a good point. And Lilje's book, I quite enjoyed it. And I didn't bring him up in this presentation because I don't really have time, but I quite enjoyed his book. And he kind of helped me understand some of these changes that I'm looking at. I mean, he's looking very much at one particular farm in the Eastern Cape by a very unique farmer who was kind of ahead of his time. And so it was difficult from his book to be able to piece it together as something that was a regional change, as opposed to something of individual progressive farmers. And what I see in Namibia is that it is a regional shift. This isn't just individual progressive farmers. This is a state-led endeavor. And to follow up with the second part of your question, was it just that the shepherds moved from doing one thing to another thing, and that they moved from watching sheep to watching wires? And for some who become the wire watchers, that is true. But for every shepherd who becomes a wire watcher, there are 3 shepherds who are sent to the homeland. And that wire watcher is often 2 or 3 days a week actually being paid to do this. So a few individuals are converted into this new position, but the majority are simply made redundant, and their skills are no longer needed. Because at the end of the day, this is no longer a shepherding system. This is no longer labor intensive. This is capital intensive. This has changed fundamentally the production process. But Lilje's book is quite enjoyable, and I really do like it.
Thanks for that, Thierry. Other questions, comments? Manda, please go ahead.
Hi, Bernard. Thanks for your presentation. I was just wondering about or let me put it this way. I've done some research in northern what was then the northern Transvaal, Soutpansberg, and quite a number of the poor white farmers were found in that region as well. I'm kind of wondering if I wasn't actually aware of that movement from South Africa to Southwest Africa, and I'm wondering about the kind of research that we have about this movement, shifting of populations from the Union of South Africa, as it were, to Southwest Africa, and what it says about the kind of regional colonialism that existed then. Thanks for your presentation.
Thanks, Manda, for the question.
Thanks, Prof. Yeah, there's a bit of work which has been done on these land settlement issues. And I think a lot of individuals in recent years have followed there was recently a JSAS special issue on what they called the South African Empire, run partially through the South African universities, University of Namibia and University of Basel. And one thing that they noted was that upon receiving the League of Nations mandate, South Africa envisioned Namibia as a place to settle. It was a settlement colony, a fifth province, so to speak. That is what they wanted. And especially then in the wake of this Carnegie Commission into the poor white issue and other kinds of poor relief schemes, such as these Orange River irrigation schemes and things like this, the South African government did view Namibia as a place where poor whites could be granted land, and it would enable them to consolidate their grip upon Namibia to a degree as well. So the land settlement issue, I mean, these guys remained poor whites until they were bailed out by Karakul. But the settlement was just as much a political project as it was an economic project and an individually led farmer project. While there were a large number of Afrikaans-speaking farmers, especially in the south of Namibia, who had settled during the German days, the vast majority came in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I can't off the top of my head remember from which province of South Africa most came. I believe it was the Northern Cape, but I'd have to go back to my notes. But this notion of the South African Empire is a good way to view this.
Patrick.
Yeah, hi, Bernie. Thanks so much for this talk. Very enlightening and interesting. I was kind of interested in your talk, the piece about the sort of like the global industry regarding vermin control, I guess, how you want to put it. But I was just curious about that. Was that something you looked into in terms of just the globalization of that, in terms of, like, for instance, the coyote getter, and how information was shared? Like, how did they learn about these things? And was there information sharing? Was there, importation of most of the materials that created these fencing and these traps and things like that? What was, that whole piece, I guess, if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that. So.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick. That's a good question. So the jackal-proof fencing in the very early days was imported from the United States, but eventually, I think the company is ACECOR, the Iron and Steel Corporation of South Africa, ended up starting producing this material. So once the jackal-proofing initiatives were so large scale that it was now profitable for South Africa to produce if they did. But it's true, the knowledge about predator control during the first half or the first 2/3 of the 20th century was a global endeavor. I found some records of these farming associations bringing in representatives from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service in order to explain how to set these poison traps, how to set a coyote getter, and how to manage these kinds of things. So there was a degree of sort of transnational collaboration between, like, the American West, Southern Africa, and Australia to a degree as well. Because this is the other thing is strychnine, as most of it's produced in India. And so it became obtaining this poison was also tapping into these global commodity chains. And I mean, these are incredibly dangerous poisons, incredibly dangerous. So it's funky. I mean, today you have a lot of people who are against the killing of predators, and some for ethical reasons, some for economic reasons. And there's this incredibly expensive Anatolian shepherds that people bring in from Europe and the United States in order to breed here, and they only operate really to a mixed effectiveness. But it's an interesting point you bring up, and I'm going to think a bit more deeper of how to conceptualize this as something that is a global trend. That's more than just commodity networks, but I suppose networks of knowledge as well.
Great stuff. Ben, I have a question after that. Okay, Ben, go ahead. You go first.
Hi, Bernie. Thanks so much for your very thorough and detailed work. My question is kind of about what you described as the fencing and water infrastructure, kind of the goal being to reduce farmers' dependency on Black workers, basically. And I was just wondering, was that aimed at reducing the dependency on sort of the highly specialized skills of shepherds, or is that sort of on the fluctuating supply of workers from the north? I mean, so which of those were kind of more the problem? And then the other, a little side thing I wanted to ask was about the Karakul farming in southern Angola, and sort of what was the role of the Southwest Africa sort of administration in that connection? Sort of, yeah, and which relates in a way to one last thing, which is kind of the relationship between the farmers' unions and the administration, sort of where there are tensions there in these in these issues.
Bernard,
Okay.
sorry, can I
Yes,
just piggyback on Ben's questions, because I think my questions are similar.
Sure.
Yeah. So I was also, this is coming from a place of naivete, so excuse my ignorance, but I was wondering, and you mentioned the labor recruitment process briefly in your presentation. So I was wondering how the infrastructure and the political economy of the labor recruitment clashed with the infrastructure and political economy of the jackal fencing. Is it a failure of the labor, exactly what Ben is asking, is it the failure of the migration infrastructure and political economy, which then acts as a catalyst for the infrastructure of the jackal fencing? Because I'm thinking more in a different sector in uranium. It's widely successful in terms of the labor recruitment, which kind of makes me think about the spatiality of the particular product and the production process, which is, I think, very key to the political economy, understanding the political economy. Though you did not mention that I mean, you probably didn't refer it to in your presentation, but I was wondering if you could also tell us a little about, if you have thought about what the spatial ramifications are in terms of this kind of analytic, especially considering this is a fencing technique, and if that actually played a role in terms of the way you've organized this excellent work. I mean, I must say, I really enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you both. I will attempt to get this across. I didn't want to dig too much into the migrant labor stuff, because the article which I just put out is very much about that. So I sort of just wanted to briefly hint on it. But about 40% of sheep farmers in Namibia, or then Southwest, about 40% of their labor force were migrant workers at the start of jackal proofing. So as in workers coming from the north of Namibia, so Ovambaland and Okavango, as well as the south of Angola. These individuals were brought in through a Namibian version, sort of very similar to this Winella of South Africa. It was called Swanla. It was a labor recruiting agency which could recruit in the north of Namibia and was doing informal recruiting through so-called runners that would trek into Angola in order to bring in about 2 in 5 workers in Swanla were Angolan as well. So these individuals were targeted to go to the mines. That is actually who was funding the most of Swanla's operations. But somewhere in the realm of high 50s, low 60s percentile, percentage of these migrant workers were actually going to farms, at which place on the farms people may learn Afrikaans, which the miners wanted, and things like this. Plus, up until 1950s, 1960s, the mines were not operating at large enough scale to actually be able to tap into this large recruitment scheme. So there were always shortages on the farms. They always wanted more workers. And they knew that they weren't going to be able to compete with the mines. I mean, your example, Prof, of the uranium sector, I presume the wages were dramatically higher for migrant workers working on uranium mines than sheep farms or cattle farms. And for that reason, if you were a migrant worker, quite often if you became classified as a C-class worker, which meant you were either somewhat disabled or too young, you would not be permitted to go to the mines. And often upon being called a Class C worker, people turned around and went right back and showed up at a different recruiting station and hoped to lie about their age and say, I'm actually 18, trust me, please send me to the mines. Because people recognized that the working conditions were quite abusive. Now, as it relates though to the question which Ben asked about, was this, let me see if I got it right. Was this simply about reducing the raw number of laborers versus reducing skill, like dependency on the skills? Am I understanding that correctly, Ben?
Yeah, pretty much, or at least not just but to reduce the numbers in order to not be affected by sort of fluctuations in the supply of that labor. You know, that the fluctuations were something that disturbed the farming, or was it the skills that they wanted to be less dependent on? Yeah, that was basically the question.
Okay, yeah, it's a combination of the two. I believe the driving factor was probably the dependency on raw numbers of workers, full stop. And remember, the majority of farm workers still were local workers at this time. It wasn't fully migrant workers. I mean, some districts like Warmbad, it was only about 1 in 8 was a migrant worker, which is a fairly low migrant worker rate anyway. So the fluctuations are and not quite as strong, I think, as we might make them out to be. But they did want to reduce their dependency on migrant workers because they recognized that the Angolans are about to move into the developing Angolan industries, because the Portuguese are further colonizing the south of Angola with Karakul sheep as well. That's another issue. But I think a lot of it was reducing the dependency upon workers in general, but it's also about reducing one's dependence upon a certain kind of worker. If you need skilled workers, you can't run a kind of ad hoc per diem arrangement. You can't really. It's very difficult. So, but being able to transition from full-time laborers who can make claims upon you, who can say, I want to keep stock here, I want to bring my family here, to moving to instead these sort of ad hoc arrangements where you can just drive into the homeland and say, I need 10 workers to maintain some fencing today. The latter is preferred for the capitalists because it's everybody is a person without qualities. Everybody is a person without a past. So, I'm not sure if that addresses the question. We can probably talk further if you'd like more.
Thanks for that, Ben, and thank you, Bernard. Excellent work, and we hope to see more of. I personally want to read more. We'll go definitely get your article, read your article. There's a minute left. If there is any final questions, comments. Anyone who wants to make? Otherwise, I know colleagues have classes to go to at 2. But again, Bernard, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
I enjoyed this.
Hope to have you again here at some point, and we'll talk more. Great.
Yeah, maybe God willing, one day I'll actually be able to not be over the internet doing this, and I'll actually be in person.
Yes, that would be lovely. Thank you again. Thank you. Thank you everyone for participating.